The surgeon who removed my appendix keeps calling to check if I'm experiencing any unusual symptoms, but I never told him I've been hiding severe pain since the surgery 8 months ago. Dr. Lowe removed my appendix last January during what he called a routine procedure. When I woke up, he seemed nervous and kept asking if everything felt normal. I lied and said yes because I wanted to go home. The truth is, my left side has been burning since that day, but I never mentioned it because I hate hospitals and didn't want more procedures. I've been taking leftover painkillers from my wisdom teeth removal and telling my wife Grace the pills are just vitamins. She believed me until last week when she found the empty bottles hidden in my gym bag. That's when everything started unraveling. Grace forced me to see our family doctor, who ordered a CT scan immediately. The radiologist took forever reviewing the images, then called in 2 other doctors to look. They kept pointing at something on the screen and whispering. Finally, they told me there was a surgical clip placed somewhere it shouldn't be, and some unusual scarring near my kidney. They asked who performed my appendectomy, and when I said Dr. Lowe at Regional Medical, they exchanged looks. The radiologist said I needed to get my surgical records immediately. At the hospital records department, the clerk got flustered when she pulled up my file. She said there was a discrepancy and needed to get her supervisor. The supervisor came out holding 2 different surgical reports with my name but different dates. One from January when I had my surgery, and another from 3 days later. The second report was signed by Dr. Lowe, but for a completely different patient named Roy, who was 73 years old. Somehow, both reports were filed under my patient number. The supervisor made copies of everything and kept apologizing, saying this never happens. When I got home, I compared both reports. My report said routine appendectomy with no complications. Roy's report described emergency surgery to repair a perforated bowel caused by accidentally nicking the intestine during an appendectomy 3 days prior. The dates lined up exactly. Roy had his appendix removed the same day as me. According to his report, Dr. Lowe had to go back in to fix his mistake. But here's what made my blood run cold. Roy's surgical report mentioned removing a damaged section near the left kidney that had been compromised by infection from the perforated bowel, the exact area where I've been having pain. I looked up Roy's full name from the report and found his obituary. He died 2 weeks after his second surgery from complications related to sepsis. His family had started a memorial fund for surgical safety awareness. His daughter Melissa ran the fund's website with a section about preventing medical errors. I reached out to Melissa pretending to be interested in donating. She told me her father went in for simple appendix removal, but the surgeon made an error that led to multiple organ failure. She said they considered legal action, but Dr. Lowe claimed Roy had underlying conditions that complicated the surgery. The hospital settled quietly with the family for an undisclosed amount. Melissa mentioned something odd, though. The hospital had initially given them the wrong surgical records with someone else's name. They had to fight for months to get Roy's actual files. She said the other patient was in their 30s and had surgery the same day. That was me. After talking to Melissa, I pulled up Dr. Lowe's surgery schedule from January. The hospital posts general schedules online for transparency. He had 3 appendectomies scheduled that day. Mine at 8 a.m., Roy's at noon, and another patient at 4 p.m. But the surgical notes in my file showed my procedure lasted 4 hours. A normal appendectomy takes maybe an hour. The timeline didn't make sense unless my surgery ran into complications he never documented. I started getting calls from Dr. Lowe's office 2 days after my CT scan. First, his nurse called saying the doctor wanted to schedule a follow-up to check on my healing. Then Dr. Lowe himself called 3 times, leaving messages about wanting to review my post-operative progress. His voice sounded strained. He mentioned he could fit me in after hours, or even meet outside the office if that was more convenient. Yesterday, I got a certified letter from Dr. Lowe's personal attorney, not the hospital's legal team. The letter said there had been an administrative error with my surgical records that needed correction. It included a document for me to sign acknowledging the error was clerical and didn't affect my care. At the bottom was a standard release of liability form. They offered me $15,000 to sign it. I drove to the hospital and requested Roy's complete medical records using a form Melissa had sent me. She'd added me as an authorized family friend for the memorial fund, which gave me access. The records showed Roy and I had the same anesthesiologist and surgical team. But the nursing notes mentioned Dr. Lowe seemed disoriented after my surgery and asked for the wrong instruments during Roy's procedure. One nurse wrote that he called Roy by my name twice. The last page had a handwritten note from a surgical resident. It said Dr. Lowe had complained of a migraine during my surgery, but refused to stop. The resident documented that the doctor's hands were shaking, and he seemed confused about which side the appendix was on. He'd started the incision on the left before correcting himself. That's exactly where my pain is. This morning, Dr. Lowe showed up at my house. I stand frozen at my front window watching Dr. Lowe get out of his car in my driveway. His hands are shaking as he smooths his shirt. Grace is at work and won't be home for 3 hours, leaving me alone to face whatever he's about to say or do. My phone sits on the coffee table behind me. I grab it and open the voice recorder app before walking to the front door. I set the phone down on the entry table inside with the microphone facing out. The recording starts. I open the door before he can knock because I don't want the neighbors seeing a confrontation on my porch. Dr. Lowe looks terrible up close with dark circles under his eyes and sweat on his forehead despite the cool morning air. His shirt collar is crooked and there's a coffee stain on his sleeve. He tries to smile, but it comes out wrong, more like a grimace. He starts talking fast about how the records mix-up was a clerical error and he just wants to make sure I'm healing properly from my routine surgery. His voice cracks when he mentions routine, and I notice he keeps glancing at my left side where the pain has been burning for 8 months. He's breathing hard like he ran here instead of driving. I step back slightly and position myself so his voice will carry clearly into the house where my phone is recording everything. He keeps talking, saying the hospital made a filing mistake with patient numbers and it's all being corrected now. His eyes dart around like he's checking if anyone else is home. I tell him I know about Roy and the perforated bowel and the second surgery 3 days after mine. His face goes completely white, and he actually stumbles backward off my front step, catching himself on the porch railing. He opens his mouth, but nothing comes out at first. Then he starts shaking his head saying no. That's not what happened. There's been a misunderstanding. But his voice is shaking worse than his hands now. I tell him I have Roy's complete medical records. I tell him I know about the migraine during my surgery and the confusion about which side the appendix was on. I tell him I know he started the incision on the left before correcting himself. That's exactly where my pain is. Doctor. Lowe's legs seem to give out, and he sits down hard on my front step. He puts his head in his hands. When he looks up, his eyes are red. He admits he made a mistake during my appendectomy, but says he corrected it immediately and there was no lasting damage. I lift my shirt to show him the exact spot where I've had constant pain for 8 months. I point to the area near my left kidney where the burning never stops. He can't meet my eyes when he sees where I'm pointing. He stares at the ground instead. Then he starts talking faster, saying he fixed the problem during the surgery, saying I shouldn't have any pain there, saying maybe it's something else entirely. But his voice keeps breaking. He begs me not to go to the medical board and offers to pay for any treatment I need out of his own pocket. He says he'll cover everything, any specialist I want to see, any tests, any procedures. He pulls out his wallet like he's going to give me cash right now. When I ask him about Roy, he breaks down crying on my porch. He's actually crying, tears running down his face. He says that was different because Roy had underlying conditions that complicated everything. He says Roy was old and had a weak immune system, and the infection spread too fast. He says there was nothing he could have done differently with Roy. But I saw the nursing notes about him calling Roy by my name during the surgery. I saw the resident's documentation about his hands shaking. He keeps wiping his face with his sleeve and trying to compose himself. He stands up and moves closer to me, still talking about how he can make this right. He says he has connections with the best surgeons in the state. He says he can get me appointments that normally take months. He says he'll personally oversee my care going forward. His voice is getting desperate now, almost pleading. I keep my position in the doorway where my phone can pick up every word. Grace's car pulls into the driveway. Dr. Lowe turns around and sees her getting out. She looks confused seeing him on our porch. She walks up fast, asking what's going on. Dr. Lowe starts talking even faster now, saying he just stopped by to check on my recovery, saying he's been concerned about my healing. Grace looks at me, and I can see she knows something is very wrong. Dr. Lowe keeps making promises about covering my medical expenses forever, about getting me the best care, about making sure I'm completely healthy. Grace pulls out her phone and steps back toward her car. She calls the police saying there's a man harassing us at our home. Dr. Lowe's face changes from desperate to panicked. He backs away from the porch holding up his hands. He's saying, wait, there's no need for that. He gets in his car and drives away fast, tires squealing slightly as he turns out of our driveway. Grace comes up to the porch asking me what just happened. I tell her to come inside. 20 minutes later, the police arrive. 2 officers get out and walk up to our door. We tell them about Dr. Lowe showing up uninvited. We tell them he was admitting to surgical errors. We tell them he was trying to pay us to keep quiet. The older officer writes everything down in a small notebook. The younger one keeps asking questions about the surgery and what Dr. Lowe said exactly. They say this is a civil matter, but they'll file a report documenting his presence and our complaint. They give us a case number and tell us to call if he comes back. After they leave, I go inside and stop the recording on my phone. Grace sits down at the kitchen table. I play the recording for her. I watch her face change from confusion to horror as she hears Dr. Lowe admit he made a mistake during my surgery. She hears him begging me not to report him. She hears him crying about Roy. When the recording ends, she just stares at me. She asks why I didn't tell her about Roy and the duplicate reports. She asks how long I've known about all this. I have to admit I was scared of what we might uncover. I tell her about meeting Melissa and getting Roy's records. I tell her about the nursing notes and the resident's documentation. I tell her about the settlement offer from Dr. Lowe's attorney. She's quiet for a long time. Then she asks me what we're going to do now. I tell her I don't know yet, but we need to talk to a lawyer. She nods and pulls out her phone. She says her brother knows people who handle medical cases. She starts making calls. Her brother picks up on the second ring. Grace explains what happened with Dr. Lowe showing up at our house and admitting he made mistakes during my surgery. She tells him about the duplicate reports and Roy's death and the settlement offer from Dr. Lowe's personal attorney. Her brother asks a bunch of questions about dates and what exactly Dr. Lowe said on our porch. Grace puts him on speaker so I can answer directly. He listens to the recording I made and goes quiet for almost a minute. Then he tells us we need a medical malpractice attorney immediately because there are time limits on filing these kinds of claims. He says he knows 3 lawyers who handle these cases, and he'll text us their contact information right now. Grace thanks him and hangs up. Within 2 minutes, her phone buzzes with 3 names and phone numbers. The first attorney on the list is someone named Jeremiah Carr, who her brother says is the best in the state for medical cases. Grace calls his office and explains the situation to his assistant. The assistant asks if we can come in tomorrow morning at 9. Grace says yes before even checking with me. We arrive at Jeremiah's office building downtown and take the elevator to the 4th floor. His assistant leads us to a conference room with a long table covered in legal pads and folders. Jeremiah walks in 5 minutes later carrying a laptop and a cup of coffee. He's younger than I expected, maybe 40, wearing a suit but no tie. He shakes both our hands and sits down across from us. I start explaining everything from the beginning, but he stops me and asks if I brought copies of the documents. I pull out the folder with the duplicate surgical reports, Roy's complete medical records, the nursing notes, the resident's documentation about Dr. Lowe's migraine, and the settlement offer from Blake Thurman. Jeremiah spreads everything across the table and starts reading. He doesn't say anything for almost 20 minutes. He takes notes on a legal pad and keeps going back to compare the dates on different documents. Finally, he looks up at us and says, "This is one of the clearest cases of medical negligence he's seen in 15 years of practice. The duplicate surgical reports alone prove something went seriously wrong with how the hospital handled both surgeries. Roy's death from complications and the settlement with his family establishes a pattern. The nursing notes and residents' documentation about Dr. Lowe being impaired during my surgery are exactly the kind of evidence that wins these cases." Jeremiah asks to hear the recording from our porch. I play it on my phone and he listens without interrupting. When Dr. Lowe's voice comes through begging me not to report him and crying about Roy, Jeremiah writes something on his legal pad and circles it 3 times. Jeremiah explains that Dr. Lowe probably nicked something during my surgery when he was confused and made the incision on the wrong side first. Instead of documenting the error and getting help, he tried to fix it himself while still impaired from his migraine. That's why my surgery took 4 hours instead of 1. The surgical clip near my kidney was likely placed during that undocumented repair attempt. The clip is pressing on tissue it shouldn't be near, which is causing the constant pain I've been hiding for 8 months. The fact that Roy had similar complications 3 hours later during his noon surgery suggests Dr. Lowe was still impaired and making mistakes. The hospital knew about the errors because they had to do emergency surgery on Roy 3 days later to fix the perforated bowel. But instead of reporting Dr. Lowe or investigating what happened during my surgery, they mixed up our surgical reports and settled quietly with Roy's family. Jeremiah says the hospital's quick settlement offer to me proves they know exactly how bad this looks. They're trying to make it go away before I find out the full extent of what happened. Grace asks what happens next. Jeremiah says we need to get a second opinion on my condition from a different surgeon to document the current damage. Then he'll file a formal malpractice claim against both Dr. Lowe and Regional Medical Center. He warns us the hospital will fight back hard because they have a lot to lose if this goes to trial. But he thinks we have an excellent case, and he's willing to take it on contingency, which means we don't pay unless we win. I call a different hospital across town and schedule an appointment with a surgeon Jeremiah recommended. The receptionist says they had a cancellation and can see me tomorrow afternoon. The new doctor's name is someone I don't recognize, which is good because I don't want anyone connected to Regional Medical. Grace takes the afternoon off work to come with me. The new surgeon looks at my CT scan results and asks a lot of questions about where exactly the pain is and how long I've been experiencing it. I tell him the truth this time instead of lying like I did with Dr. Lowe. He examines the area where the pain is worst and presses gently near my left kidney. The pressure makes me wince. He says he wants to order an MRI and some additional scans to see exactly what's causing my chronic pain and whether the surgical clip needs to be removed. He schedules the MRI for 3 days from now. Grace squeezes my hand while the doctor explains the procedure. Walking out to the parking lot, I realize this is the first time since my original surgery that a doctor has actually listened to me and taken my pain seriously. My phone rings while Grace and I are making dinner that night. The caller ID shows a number I don't recognize. I answer, and a woman's voice asks if this is me using my full name. I say yes and ask who's calling. She says her name is Melissa, and she's Roy's daughter. My stomach drops. She asks why I've been looking at her father's memorial fund access logs. I had no idea the website tracked who viewed the records. She says she's been monitoring everyone who accesses Roy's medical information because she suspected the hospital was keeping tabs on her family's case. When she saw my name pop up yesterday, she looked me up and found out I had surgery at Regional Medical the same day as her father. She wants to know what's going on and why I'm interested in her father's death. I tell Grace to keep cooking and I go outside to the back porch. I explain everything to Melissa about my surgery and the duplicate reports and Dr. Lowe showing up at my house. I tell her about the surgical clip near my kidney and the 8 months of hidden pain. I tell her about the nursing notes that mention Dr. Lowe calling Roy by my name during his surgery. Melissa is quiet for a long time. Then she starts crying. She says she knew something was wrong with the timeline, but the hospital's lawyers made her family feel crazy for questioning anything. They kept saying Roy's underlying conditions caused the complications. But Roy was healthy before his appendectomy. He played tennis twice a week and had no major health problems. The hospital wore her family down until they accepted the settlement just to make it stop. I meet Melissa at a coffee shop 2 days later. She's younger than I expected, probably early 30s, wearing jeans and a sweater. She's carrying a thick folder under her arm. We sit at a corner table away from other people. I show her copies of the duplicate surgical reports and play the recording of Dr. Lowe's confession on my porch. She listens with her hand over her mouth. When the recording ends, she opens her folder and spreads out documents across the table. She's been quietly documenting everything about her father's case for the past 8 months, even though the settlement included a strict non-disclosure agreement. The NDA prevents her family from discussing the case publicly or talking to the media. But Melissa says she couldn't just let it go. She knew other victims might come forward eventually, and she wanted to be ready with evidence. She shows me her father's complete surgical timeline, with notes about every inconsistency she found. She has copies of emails between the hospital's legal team and her family's attorney. She has records of every phone call and meeting. She's been building a case file in secret, hoping someone else would step forward. Seeing all her documentation laid out makes me realize how much work she's put into this. She says she's relieved someone finally came forward because it means her father's death might actually lead to changes that prevent other families from going through the same thing. The MRI appointment arrives and I spend 45 minutes lying completely still inside the machine while it makes loud banging noises. The technician gives me earplugs, but I can still feel the vibrations through my whole body. Grace waits in the lobby reading a magazine. After the MRI, they do 2 more scans with different machines. The whole process takes almost 3 hours. The new surgeon's office calls me the next morning and asks if I can come in that afternoon to review the results. Grace leaves work early again and meets me at the hospital. The surgeon pulls up the MRI images on his computer screen and points to several areas near my left kidney. He says there's significant scar tissue that shouldn't be there, and the surgical clip is pressing against tissue it shouldn't be near. The clip appears to be holding together a repair that was never documented in my surgical records. He says I need corrective surgery soon because the current situation could lead to kidney damage if left untreated. The scar tissue is already affecting kidney function, and the pressure from the clip is getting worse. He can schedule the surgery in about 3 weeks. Grace asks if waiting 3 weeks is safe, and he says yes, but we shouldn't delay longer than that. I sign the consent forms right there in his office. Jeremiah files the formal medical malpractice claim against Dr. Lowe and Regional Medical Center the next day. He calls me that evening to say the paperwork has been submitted to the court and served to both defendants. He warns me to expect contact from the hospital's legal team very soon. They'll try to settle before things escalate further. He's right. 2 days later, I get a call from an attorney representing Regional Medical Center. The attorney says they'd like to meet and discuss a resolution. His voice is smooth and professional, like he does this every day. He suggests we meet at the hospital's administrative offices tomorrow morning. I tell him I need to check with my attorney first. Jeremiah says he'll come with me to the meeting and tells me not to agree to anything without talking to him first. Grace takes time off work to come too, because she doesn't want me facing the hospital's lawyers without support. We arrive at Regional Medical Center and follow signs to the administrative wing. A receptionist leads us to a conference room with windows overlooking the parking lot. The hospital's attorney is already there with 2 other people in suits. Everyone shakes hands and sits down. The attorney starts by saying the hospital regrets any confusion about my surgical records and wants to resolve this matter quickly. He slides a document across the table. The offer is for $75,000 to settle immediately, with a non-disclosure agreement attached. The amount is significantly more than Dr. Lowe's personal offer of $15,000, but it still feels wrong. Jeremiah picks up the document and reads through it carefully. The NDA would prevent me from discussing my surgery or the settlement with anyone except immediate family. I couldn't talk to other potential victims or share information about what happened. Grace looks at me, and I can tell she's thinking the same thing I am. This is exactly what they did to Melissa's family. They're trying to bury the evidence and make sure no one else finds out about the pattern of negligence. Jeremiah leans back in his chair and taps the hospital's settlement document with his pen. He says the $75,000 offer is insulting, given what we've uncovered about Roy's death and the pattern of negligence. His voice is calm, but there's anger underneath when he explains that Roy died from the exact same kind of surgical error I survived. The hospital knows we have evidence of multiple cover-ups, including the duplicate surgical reports and the missing documentation about complications during my procedure. He tells us the quick settlement offer means they're scared of what a full investigation might reveal about how many other patients Dr. Lowe hurt. Grace squeezes my hand and asks what he thinks my case is actually worth. Jeremiah says with Roy's death establishing negligence and the documented cover-up of surgical errors, we're looking at significantly more than $75,000. He recommends we reject their offer and push for a complete audit of all Dr. Lowe's surgical cases from the past 3 years. The hospital will fight that hard because they know what we'll find. I leave Jeremiah's office with copies of everything we've discussed and drive straight to the hospital parking garage. I sit in my car for 20 minutes working up the courage to call the surgical resident whose name was on that handwritten note about Dr. Lowe's migraine. Her number is in the hospital directory as part of the surgical department contact list. When she answers, I tell her my name and that I was Dr. Lowe's patient last January. There's a long silence before she asks how I got her number. I explain I have copies of the surgical notes, including her documentation about Dr. Lowe's condition during my procedure. She says she can't talk about patient cases and starts to hang up. I tell her I know she wrote that Dr. Lowe was shaking and confused about which side my appendix was on. Another silence, then she asks what I want. I say, I just want to understand what happened during my surgery and why I've been in pain for 8 months. She tells me she gets off shift at 7 and agrees to meet me at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the hospital. Grace texts asking where I am, and I tell her I'm running errands. I hate lying to her again after everything, but I need to hear what Valerie has to say before I involve Grace in more of this investigation. The coffee shop is nearly empty when I arrive at 7:15. Valerie walks in wearing scrubs with her hospital badge still clipped to her shirt. She looks younger than I expected, maybe 30, with dark circles under her eyes like she hasn't been sleeping well. She orders black coffee and sits across from me in a corner booth. I thank her for meeting me, and she immediately says she could lose her job for talking to me about Dr. Lowe. I slide copies of her surgical notes across the table and tell her I already have everything she documented. She stares at the papers and her hands start shaking. She says she's been carrying guilt about my surgery since the day it happened because she knew Dr. Lowe shouldn't have been operating. He complained about a severe migraine before we even started, and she could see he was disoriented when he scrubbed in. She asked the charge nurse if they should postpone, but Dr. Lowe refused because he was already behind on his surgical quota for the month. Valerie's voice drops to almost a whisper when she describes what happened in the operating room. She says Dr. Lowe's hands were shaking so badly the scrub nurse had to steady his wrist during the initial incision. He started cutting on my left side before the anesthesiologist reminded him the appendix is on the right. She documented everything in her notes because she was terrified something would go wrong. When the surgery took 4 hours instead of 1, she knew there had been complications Dr. Lowe wasn't admitting to. She filed her notes with the surgical records like she was supposed to, but the next day the chief of surgery called her into his office. He told her Dr. Lowe was an important surgeon who brought significant revenue to the hospital. He said her notes about the migraine and confusion were subjective observations that could damage Dr. Lowe's reputation unfairly. He strongly suggested she keep quiet about what she witnessed unless there was a formal investigation. She was only 6 months into her residency and terrified of losing her position, so she stayed silent. Now she looks at me with tears in her eyes and says she's sorry she didn't speak up sooner. I drive home feeling sick about what Valerie told me, but also relieved to finally understand why I've been in pain. Grace's car is already in the driveway when I pull up. I walk in expecting her to be making dinner, but instead she's sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of her. She looks up at me and asks where I've really been for the past 3 hours. My stomach drops because I can tell from her face she knows I've been lying. She holds up her phone showing a text from Melissa, asking if I got useful information from my meeting with the surgical resident. I forgot Melissa and I have been texting about the case, and Grace has access to my phone through our shared cloud account. Grace's voice is shaking when she asks why I'm still keeping secrets after everything we went through with the hidden painkillers. I try to explain I was just trying to protect her from more stress, but she cuts me off. She says she thought we were partners in this investigation, but I've been secretly meeting with Valerie and Melissa without telling her what I'm learning. Her eyes are red and I realize she's been crying. She asks if I'm ever going to trust her enough to include her in the important parts of my life, or if I'm always going to handle everything alone. I sit down across from Grace and tell her she's right. I apologize for meeting with Valerie without telling her and promise I won't keep anything from her anymore. She wipes her eyes and says she needs me to prove that with actions, not just words. I pull out all the notes from my meeting with Valerie and spread them on the table. I explain everything Valerie told me about Dr. Lowe's migraine, the shaking hands, the wrong side incision, and the chief of surgery ordering her to stay quiet. Grace reads through Valerie's documentation, and her face goes pale when she sees the part about Dr. Lowe starting the cut on the wrong side. She asks if that's why I have scarring on my left side where my appendix isn't even located. I nod and show her the part of Valerie's notes describing the 4-hour surgery that should have taken 1 hour. Grace puts her hand over her mouth and says she can't believe the hospital knew about all this and just covered it up. I tell her about Jeremiah's advice to reject the settlement and push for a full investigation. She agrees immediately and says we need to make sure no other patients go through what I did or what happened to Roy. 2 days later, Jeremiah calls saying someone from the hospital contacted his office asking to provide testimony. I put him on speaker so Grace can hear. Jeremiah says the anesthesiologist from my surgery reached out directly instead of going through the hospital's legal team. His name is Hiroshi Gupta, and he's retiring in 2 months. He told Jeremiah he's been waiting until his retirement was secure before speaking up about what happened during my procedure. Hiroshi wants to provide detailed testimony about Dr. Lowe's impaired condition and the concerns he raised during my surgery. Jeremiah sounds excited because having the anesthesiologist confirm everything Valerie documented will make our case much stronger. He's scheduled a meeting with Hiroshi for tomorrow afternoon and wants us to be there. Grace immediately says she's taking the afternoon off work because there's no way she's missing this meeting. We meet Hiroshi at Jeremiah's office the next day. He's an older man, maybe 65, with gray hair and a calm, professional manner. He shakes our hands and apologizes for not coming forward sooner. Then he sits down and confirms everything Valerie told me about Dr. Lowe being impaired during my surgery. Hiroshi says he raised concerns with the surgical team 3 separate times during the procedure. The first time was when Dr. Lowe's hands were shaking so badly during the initial incision. The second was when Dr. Lowe seemed confused about the surgical site. The third was 2 hours into what should have been a 1-hour surgery, when it became clear there were complications Dr. Lowe wasn't handling well. Each time Hiroshi recommended stopping the procedure and bringing in another surgeon. Each time Dr. Lowe overruled him and insisted he was fine to continue. Hiroshi documented all his objections in the anesthesia notes, which should be part of my complete medical record. He kept his own copies of everything because he was worried the hospital might try to make problems disappear. Jeremiah immediately requests my complete anesthesia records from the hospital through a formal legal demand. 3 days later, the hospital's attorney calls saying there's a problem with the records. Jeremiah puts the call on speaker in his office with me and Grace listening. The attorney claims my anesthesia notes were accidentally purged during a system upgrade 6 months ago. Jeremiah asks how a system upgrade could delete specific patient records when everything is supposed to have automatic backups. The attorney stammers something about technical difficulties and offers to have their IT department investigate. Jeremiah tells him not to bother, because we already have copies of the anesthesia notes directly from Hiroshi. There's dead silence on the phone before the attorney says he'll need to call back after consulting with his clients. Hiroshi's copies show he documented his concerns 3 times during my surgery, exactly like he told us. The notes indicate the surgery took 4 hours from start to finish, not the 1 hour listed in Dr. Lowe's official surgical report. The anesthesia records also show I received significantly more pain medication during the procedure than normal for a routine appendectomy, which supports Valerie's account that there were undocumented complications Dr. Lowe was trying to fix. The new surgeon schedules my corrective surgery for 3 weeks out and spends almost an hour explaining exactly what he plans to do. He shows me diagrams of where the surgical clip is positioned and traces the path he'll take to remove it without causing more damage. Grace asks about recovery time, and he says probably 2 weeks before I can return to work. Maybe longer, depending on what he finds once he's in there. She immediately calls her boss and requests additional time off, saying this is a medical emergency that can't wait. Her company only gives her 10 days of paid leave per year, and she's already used 4 of them dealing with my CT scans and doctor appointments, but she doesn't hesitate to ask for more. The surgeon makes her write down his direct cell number and tells her to call him anytime, day or night, if she has questions or concerns. He says he's been reviewing Hiroshi's anesthesia notes and the surgical resident's documentation about Dr. Lowe's condition during my original procedure, and he wants everything documented with video this time, so there's no question about what happened in the operating room. 2 days after we schedule the surgery, Jeremiah calls saying the medical board has officially opened an investigation into Dr. Lowe based on our complaint and all the evidence we provided. He says an investigator will need to interview me, Grace, Melissa, Valerie, and Hiroshi over the next couple weeks to build their case. The investigator shows up at our house the following Monday morning with a briefcase full of forms and a recording device. She's maybe 50 years old with gray hair pulled back tight, and she doesn't waste time with small talk. She asks me to describe every detail I remember from the day of my surgery, starting from when I arrived at the hospital. I tell her about Dr. Lowe seeming nervous when I woke up, about the burning pain in my left side that started immediately, about hiding it for 8 months because I was scared of more procedures. She writes everything down and asks specific questions about conversations I had with Dr. Lowe during follow-up calls. Then she interviews Grace separately in our kitchen while I wait in the living room. I can hear Grace's voice getting louder when she talks about finding the hidden painkiller bottles and forcing me to get the CT scan. The investigator spends 3 hours at our house going through every document we have, making copies of everything, asking the same questions multiple ways to check if our stories match. She interviews Melissa the next day at the Memorial Fund office. Melissa calls me afterward and says the investigator asked detailed questions about Roy's surgery timeline and the hospital's initial mistake with the records. The investigator wanted to know if anyone from the hospital ever admitted the records mix-up was more than just a clerical error. Melissa told her about the months her family spent fighting to get Roy's actual surgical files and how the hospital kept insisting they had the right records even when the patient name and age were obviously wrong. Valerie gets interviewed at a coffee shop near the hospital because she's worried about being seen talking to investigators on the hospital property. She tells me later that the investigator asked her why she didn't report Dr. Lowe's impaired condition to the medical board immediately after my surgery. Valerie said she was a surgical resident at the time, and the chief of surgery explicitly told her to keep quiet about the incident or risk her career. The investigator made her sign a statement saying the chief of surgery ordered her silence. Hiroshi's interview happens at his home since he's already retired and doesn't care what the hospital thinks anymore. He brings out 3 banker's boxes full of copies he made of anesthesia notes from surgeries where he had concerns about other doctors. He tells the investigator he's been documenting problems for years, but nobody at the hospital ever wanted to hear about it. 3 days after the medical board investigator finishes her interviews, Jeremiah gets a call from Blake Thurman wanting to negotiate a personal settlement separate from whatever the hospital might offer. Blake says Dr. Lowe is willing to pay $200,000 out of his own pocket and voluntarily surrender his medical license if we agree not to pursue criminal charges. Jeremiah puts the call on speaker in his office so Grace and I can hear the whole conversation. Blake's voice sounds tired and he keeps saying Dr. Lowe just wants to make things right and move on with his life. Jeremiah asks him why Dr. Lowe would surrender his medical license if he didn't do anything wrong, and Blake goes quiet for almost 30 seconds before saying his client recognizes there were errors in judgment that day. Grace leans forward and asks Blake directly if Dr. Lowe admits he was impaired during my surgery. Blake says he can't comment on specific details, but the settlement offer speaks for itself. Jeremiah tells him we'll discuss it and get back to him, then ends the call. After Blake hangs up, Jeremiah explains that we can't actually pursue criminal charges ourselves because that's not how the system works. The state attorney's office would have to decide whether to bring criminal charges based on evidence of fraud or negligence that rises to criminal level. But the fact that Blake is offering license surrender suggests Dr. Lowe knows his career is finished regardless of what we decide to do. Jeremiah says the $200,000 offer is significant money, but it's also an admission that Dr. Lowe did something seriously wrong during my surgery. Grace asks if accepting the money would prevent the medical board from taking action against Dr. Lowe. Jeremiah says no. The medical board investigation is completely separate from any private settlement we might reach. The board will make their own decision about his license based on their findings. I tell Jeremiah I want to wait until after my corrective surgery to make any decisions about settlements because I still don't know the full extent of the damage Dr. Lowe caused. The hospital's legal team calls Jeremiah 2 days later and increases their settlement offer to $300,000. They're still requiring a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent us from discussing the case publicly or helping other potential victims come forward. Jeremiah reviews the new offer with us in his office and says this amount is much closer to fair value for what we've been through. But he's clearly bothered by the NDA requirement. He pulls up news articles on his computer about other medical malpractice cases where NDAS prevented patterns of negligence from being discovered until multiple patients were harmed. Grace asks what happens if we reject the NDA and the hospital refuses to settle. Jeremiah says we'd have to go to trial, which could take 2 years, and there's no guarantee we'd win even with all our evidence. He also points out that my corrective surgery is happening in 10 days, and we might want to wait and see what the new surgeon finds before making settlement decisions. The hospital's attorney is pushing for a quick answer, but Jeremiah tells them we need time to consider all our options. My corrective surgery is scheduled for early morning on a Thursday. Grace takes the whole week off work to be with me through the procedure and recovery. We arrive at the hospital at 6 in the morning, and the new surgeon meets us in the pre-op area. He goes over the surgical plan one more time and shows us the video equipment he'll be using to document everything. The anesthesiologist introduces himself and reviews my medical history, paying special attention to Hiroshi's notes from my first surgery. He says he's read through everything and knows exactly what went wrong 8 months ago, and he promises nothing like that will happen today. Grace holds my hand while they start the IV and wheel me toward the operating room. The last thing I remember is her face looking scared but trying to smile for me. I wake up 4 hours later in the recovery room with Grace sitting next to my bed. The new surgeon is standing at the foot of the bed looking serious. He tells me the surgery went well, but he found significantly more damage than the MRI showed. There's extensive scarring around my kidney from the original surgery, and clear evidence of a previous repair attempt that was never documented anywhere in my official surgical records. He removed the misplaced surgical clip and repaired the damaged tissue, but the scarring suggests I had internal bleeding that Dr. Lowe tried to fix without telling anyone. The surgeon says he took detailed photographs of everything he found, and the video recording captured the entire procedure. He's writing a comprehensive report for Jeremiah that documents all the undocumented damage from Dr. Lowe's surgery. Grace squeezes my hand and asks if my kidney will be okay. The surgeon says yes. Now that the pressure from the clip is gone and the damaged tissue is repaired, my kidney should recover fully over the next few months. I spend 2 nights in the hospital recovering from the corrective surgery. Grace stays with me the entire time, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair next to my bed. The new surgeon visits twice a day to check my incisions and make sure there are no complications. On the second day, he brings printed copies of the photographs he took during surgery. The images show thick scar tissue wrapped around my kidney and the surgical clip embedded in tissue where it absolutely should not have been. He points out areas of old damage that clearly resulted from bleeding that was stopped but never properly repaired. He says he's never seen a case quite like this where a surgeon caused damage, attempted a repair, and then documented none of it. He's sending his complete report with all the photographs to Jeremiah by the end of the week. While I'm still in the hospital recovering, Jeremiah calls Grace to say 2 more former patients of Dr. Lowe contacted his office after hearing about the medical board investigation. Both patients had complications from appendectomies performed by Dr. Lowe within the past 2 years. Both were offered quick settlements with non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from discussing their cases or warning other patients. One of them ended up needing a second surgery to fix problems from Dr. Lowe's original procedure, just like Roy did. The other patient has chronic pain similar to what I experienced, but was told by Dr. Lowe that it was normal post-surgical discomfort that would eventually go away. Jeremiah says these new cases establish a clear pattern of negligence and cover-ups. He's documenting everything and plans to share the information with the medical board investigator. Grace spends hours on her laptop researching Dr. Lowe's surgical history while I'm sleeping off the pain medication. She finds public records of malpractice settlements and uses the information from Jeremiah's new clients to search for similar cases. What she discovers makes her actually gasp out loud, which wakes me up. Dr. Lowe has had an unusually high complication rate for routine procedures over the past 3 years compared to other surgeons at Regional Medical. She finds records of at least 6 settlements in cases involving his surgeries, though the details are sealed because of the NDAs. She also discovers that his surgical volume increased dramatically 3 years ago when the hospital promoted him to head of general surgery. The higher volume meant more revenue for the hospital, which probably explains why they didn't look too closely at his complication rate. Grace prints out everything she finds and adds it to the growing file of evidence we're building against Dr. Lowe and the hospital. The medical board investigator calls Jeremiah on my 3rd day home from the hospital. She says they've found evidence of multiple unreported complications in Dr. Lowe's surgical cases going back at least 3 years. The hospital knew about the pattern because their internal quality review board flagged his cases twice for having complication rates above normal ranges. But instead of restricting his surgical privileges or requiring additional oversight, the hospital allowed him to continue operating because he was bringing in significant revenue from his high surgery volume. The investigator found internal emails where hospital administrators discussed Dr. Lowe's complication rate and decided the settlements were cheaper than losing his surgical income. She says this information changes everything, because it shows the hospital actively chose profit over patient safety. Jeremiah asks if this means criminal charges are possible. The investigator says she's referring her findings to the state attorney's office for review, and they'll decide whether the evidence supports criminal fraud charges against both Dr. Lowe and hospital administrators. Melissa calls me 2 days after her conversation with Jeremiah's investigator. Her voice sounds different from before, stronger and more determined. She tells me her family held an emergency meeting with their attorney about the NDA they signed when they settled Roy's case. Their lawyer reviewed all the documents and discovered something important in the fine print. The hospital's settlement agreement included a clause requiring them to disclose any known pattern of similar incidents, and they never mentioned the other victims or Dr. Lowe's history of complications. Their attorney argues this means the hospital committed fraud when they negotiated the original settlement, which makes the entire NDA invalid and unenforceable. Melissa says her family voted unanimously to go public with Roy's case despite the risks. They're holding a press conference next week to share what happened to her father and how the hospital tried to hide the truth. She asks if I want to be there, but I tell her I need to check with Jeremiah first about how this affects my case. Grace sits next to me on the couch while I relay everything Melissa said. She grabs my hand and squeezes it hard, and I can feel her shaking with anger about how many people the hospital hurt while hiding behind legal agreements. I call Jeremiah immediately, and he answers on the first ring. Before I can explain why I'm calling, he tells me a reporter from the local news station contacted his office this morning, asking questions about Dr. low and regional medical's surgical complication rates. The reporter somehow found out about the medical board investigation and wants to interview victims who are willing to speak on camera. Jeremiah says the reporter specifically mentioned my name, which means someone leaked information about my case to the media. He advises me to decline any interview requests until after we settle with the hospital, because talking publicly could complicate negotiations and potentially reduce our settlement amount. I tell him about Melissa's family breaking their NDA and going public next week. Jeremiah goes quiet for a long moment, then says, "This changes everything about our timeline and strategy. If Melissa's family goes public first, the hospital will panic and might offer us a better settlement to prevent more victims from coming forward. But if I give an interview before we settle, the hospital might dig in and refuse to negotiate, forcing us into a long trial that could take years." I ask him what he thinks I should do, and he says the smart move legally is to stay quiet and let Melissa's family take the lead while we negotiate behind the scenes. But he also says he understands if I feel obligated to warn other patients about Dr. Lowe, even if it costs me money in the settlement. Grace takes the phone from me and asks Jeremiah directly whether speaking out would hurt our case. He tells her it depends on how the hospital reacts, but most likely they would see it as a hostile act and become less willing to settle quickly. She thanks him and hangs up, then looks at me with tears in her eyes. She says she wants justice for what happened to me, but she also wants to make sure no one else gets hurt by Dr. Lowe. We both know we're stuck between protecting ourselves financially and doing what might help other victims. The hospital's legal team calls Jeremiah the morning after Melissa's family announces their press conference. He puts them on speaker so Grace and I can listen from his office. The lead attorney sounds frantic and keeps talking over herself about wanting to resolve my case quickly before things escalate further. She offers us $500,000 with no NDA requirement, which is almost double their previous offer. The only condition is that we settle within 48 hours before Melissa's press conference happens. Jeremiah asks why they're suddenly so generous, and the attorney admits they're concerned about media attention bringing more victims forward. She says the hospital wants to demonstrate good faith by settling fairly with victims who were harmed, and they're willing to pay significantly more to avoid a public trial. Jeremiah tells them we need time to discuss the offer, and he'll call back tomorrow with our answer. After he hangs up, he leans back in his chair and lets out a long breath. He says this is an excellent settlement that would cover all my medical expenses, compensate us for what we've been through, and still allow us to speak publicly about our experience if we choose. The lack of an NDA means we wouldn't be silenced like Roy's family was. But he also warns us that accepting any settlement means giving up our right to a trial, which would expose everything publicly and potentially lead to criminal charges against hospital administrators. Grace and I spend the entire evening sitting at our kitchen table, discussing whether to accept the settlement or push for a trial. She makes a list of pros and cons on a legal pad, writing down every argument we can think of on both sides. The money would be life-changing for us and would cover the costs of my corrective surgery, plus compensate us for the 8 months of pain I endured. We could pay off our mortgage and finally take the vacation we've been planning for years. But a trial might prevent future victims by forcing the hospital to admit publicly what they did and how they covered it up. Grace keeps coming back to the fact that Dr. Lowe is still operating on patients right now while the medical board investigation continues. She worries that accepting a settlement and moving on with our lives means abandoning other people who might get hurt. I remind her that the medical board investigation will continue regardless of what we decide, and Melissa's family going public will bring attention to the pattern of negligence, even if we settle quietly. She nods, but I can see she's not convinced. We talk in circles for hours without reaching a decision, both of us feeling the weight of choosing between our own financial security and potentially helping strangers we'll never meet. Jeremiah calls us the next morning to discuss the settlement offer one final time before we give the hospital our answer. He walks us through what a trial would actually involve, explaining that it could take 2 to 3 years to reach a courtroom, and there's no guarantee we would win or get a better outcome than the current offer. The hospital has unlimited resources to drag out litigation, and trials are emotionally exhausting for everyone involved. He points out that my corrective surgery was successful and I'm healing well, which weakens our case for ongoing damages. A jury might award us less than $500,000 if they decide my injuries weren't severe enough to justify a larger amount. He also reminds us that the medical board investigation will continue regardless of our settlement, which means the systemic issues at regional medical will still be addressed through that process. His professional recommendation is to accept the settlement because it's a fair amount that compensates us adequately without the risk and stress of a multi-year trial. Grace asks him point blank if he thinks we're selling out by taking the money instead of fighting publicly. Jeremiah says that's a personal question only we can answer, but from a legal standpoint, we've already accomplished something important by forcing the hospital to acknowledge their negligence and pay for what they did. Sometimes the practical choice is also the right choice, even if it doesn't feel as satisfying as a dramatic courtroom victory. We accept the $500,000 settlement with no NDA requirement. Jeremiah handles all the paperwork and negotiations with the hospital's legal team over the next week. The settlement agreement includes language requiring regional medical to implement new surgical safety protocols and oversight procedures for surgeons with high complication rates. They also agree to mandatory reporting of surgical errors to the medical board within 24 hours, which should prevent future cover-ups like what happened with Dr. Lowe. Grace reads every page of the settlement documents twice before we sign them, making sure there are no hidden clauses that would prevent us from speaking about our experience. The hospital transfers the money into our account 3 days after we sign, and seeing that amount in our bank balance feels surreal after everything we've been through. We don't celebrate because it doesn't feel like a victory, just the end of a nightmare that shouldn't have happened in the first place. Melissa calls to congratulate us on the settlement and says her family's press conference generated significant media attention that probably helped push the hospital to settle with us quickly. She invites us to speak at a patient safety conference she's organizing next month, and I tell her we'll think about it. The state medical board suspends Dr. Lowe's license 2 weeks after we settle our case. Jeremiah forwards me the official notification from the board, explaining that their investigation uncovered enough evidence of negligence and falsified records to warrant immediate suspension pending a full hearing. The board found at least 8 cases over the past 3 years where Dr. Lowe performed surgeries while impaired or made errors that he failed to document properly. They also discovered he falsified surgical reports on multiple occasions to hide complications from patients and hospital administrators. The suspension means he cannot perform any surgeries or treat patients until the board completes their hearing process, which could take several months. Jeremiah says the evidence against him is so overwhelming that his medical license will almost certainly be permanently revoked. Grace prints out the notification and adds it to the thick folder of documents we've collected throughout this process. She says she wants to keep everything organized in case anyone ever questions what happened or why we settled. I realize she's thinking about the future and wanting to make sure we have proof of everything if we decide to speak publicly about our experience. A reporter from the local news station contacts me directly 3 days after Dr. Lowe's suspension becomes public. She leaves a voicemail asking if I would be willing to give an on-camera interview about my experience with Dr. Lowe and how the hospital handled my case. Jeremiah already gave me permission to speak to the media now that our settlement is finalized, but I'm nervous about going on television and sharing such personal details about my medical situation. Grace encourages me to do the interview, saying it might help other victims feel less alone and could pressure the hospital to take their new safety protocols seriously. I call the reporter back and agree to an interview, as long as I can focus on the importance of patients speaking up about complications rather than dwelling on graphic medical details. She seems relieved and professional, promising to keep the interview focused on patient advocacy and safety awareness. We schedule the interview for the following week at a neutral location downtown. Melissa agrees to appear in the same news segment to talk about her father's case, which makes me feel less alone in sharing my story. The reporter says she's also interviewing a patient safety expert who will provide context about how common these situations are and what systemic changes are needed. The interview airs on the evening news 2 weeks later, and Grace and I watch it together on our couch with our hands clasped tight. Seeing myself on television talking about hiding pain for 8 months and discovering the truth about Dr. Lowe feels strange and exposing. But the reporter edited the segment well, focusing on my message about not accepting quick settlements that hide patterns of negligence and the importance of patients trusting their instincts when something feels wrong. Melissa's portion about her father is heartbreaking and powerful, and several times during the broadcast, I have to pause and breathe deeply to keep from crying. The patient safety expert explains that medical errors are far more common than most people realize, and non-disclosure agreements prevent victims from warning others about dangerous doctors and hospitals. Within an hour of the broadcast ending, 3 people contact Jeremiah's office saying they were former patients of Dr. Lowe who had complications from routine surgeries. All 3 were offered settlements with NDAs that prevented them from speaking about what happened. Jeremiah takes their information and promises to review their cases, though he warns them that the statute of limitations might have expired on some claims. Grace gets a text from Melissa saying the Memorial Fund's website crashed from too much traffic after the news segment aired. Apparently, hundreds of people are trying to access information about surgical safety and how to report medical errors. Regional Medical places their chief of surgery on administrative leave the day after our news interview airs. The hospital releases a brief statement saying they're conducting an internal investigation into the handling of surgical complications and patient safety protocols. Grace finds the announcement buried on the hospital's website and reads it out loud to me with obvious satisfaction in her voice. Jeremiah calls later that afternoon to tell us his source inside the hospital says the chief of surgery is the administrator who ordered Valerie to keep quiet about Dr. Lowe's impairment during my surgery. The internal investigation apparently uncovered emails and documents proving he knew about Dr. Lowe's high complication rate for at least 18 months, but chose not to restrict his surgical privileges because Dr. Lowe brought in significant revenue from his high surgery volume. The chief of surgery prioritized money over patient safety, and now the hospital is trying to distance themselves from his decisions by making him the scapegoat. Jeremiah says 2 other administrators are also under investigation for their roles in covering up the pattern of negligence. Grace asks if this means criminal charges are possible, and Jeremiah says the state attorney's office is reviewing all the evidence from the medical board investigation to determine if fraud charges are warranted. He reminds us that our settlement protects us from any further involvement in criminal proceedings unless we choose to cooperate voluntarily. I tell him we'll cooperate fully if it means holding people accountable for what they did. The new surgeon schedules my follow-up appointments every 2 weeks for the first month after the corrective surgery. Each time he checks my kidney function with blood tests and asks detailed questions about my pain levels. I tell him the truth now, because hiding things almost destroyed my kidney and my marriage. The burning sensation in my left side disappears completely after 3 weeks, and I realize how much energy I wasted fighting through constant pain for 8 months. Grace comes to every appointment and takes notes on everything the surgeon says about my recovery timeline. She asks questions I wouldn't think to ask about diet restrictions and activity levels and when I can return to normal exercise. The surgeon says my kidney is healing faster than expected because we caught the problem before permanent damage occurred. He shows us comparison scans from before and after the corrective surgery, pointing out how the pressure from the misplaced clip was compressing tissue that now looks healthy again. Grace squeezes my hand when he says I should make a full recovery with no lasting effects. Grace finds a couples counselor who specializes in medical trauma and trust issues. Our first session happens 3 days after my final follow-up with the surgeon. The counselor's office is in a converted house with comfortable chairs and soft lighting that makes the space feel safe instead of clinical. She asks us each to describe what happened from our perspective without interrupting each other. Grace talks about finding the hidden painkiller bottles and feeling betrayed that I didn't trust her enough to share what I was going through. I explain how my fear of hospitals made me hide the pain, then how my investigation into the medical records made me keep more secrets because I wanted to protect her from worry. The counselor helps us see how my pattern of hiding things to avoid conflict actually created bigger problems than honesty would have caused. She gives us homework about sharing one difficult truth with each other every day, even if it feels uncomfortable. Grace admits she's scared I'll hide things again when problems come up. I promise to work on trusting her with hard conversations instead of trying to handle everything alone. Jeremiah calls me 6 weeks after we sign the settlement papers. He says 3 of his current clients are struggling to pursue medical malpractice cases because they can't afford the upfront costs for expert witnesses and medical record reviews. Most malpractice attorneys work on contingency fees where they only get paid if they win, but the initial expenses still come from somewhere. He asks if I'd be interested in using part of my settlement money to create a fund that covers these startup costs for patients who can't afford them. I talked to Grace about it that night over dinner. She thinks it's a good way to turn what happened to me into something that helps other people. We decide to put $50,000 into a fund that Jeremiah will manage through his law firm. He sets up a simple application process where patients submit their medical records and a brief explanation of what happened. A review committee of 3 attorneys evaluates each case to determine if it has merit and needs financial support. The fund covers costs for expert medical witnesses, copying fees for hospital records, and initial filing expenses. Jeremiah says this could help 5 to 8 patients pursue cases they otherwise couldn't afford to bring forward. The prosecutor from the state attorney's office contacts me 2 months after the medical board completes their investigation into the hospital. She introduces herself as the lead attorney handling white-collar crime cases and says she's been reviewing all the evidence the medical board collected about falsified records and covered-up complications. She wants to meet with me and Grace to discuss the criminal aspects of what happened with my surgery and the hospital's response. We drive to the state attorney's office downtown and spend 4 hours going through every detail of the case. The prosecutor is particularly interested in the duplicate surgical reports filed under my patient number and the hospital's attempts to get me to sign a liability release before I understood what really happened. She says the evidence we gathered about the chief of surgery ordering staff to stay quiet about complications could support fraud charges. She explains that while medical malpractice is usually a civil matter between patients and doctors, deliberately falsifying records and covering up patterns of negligence can cross into criminal territory. She needs my permission to use the recordings I made of conversations with hospital staff and the documentation Valerie provided about being told to keep quiet. I sign the authorization forms, allowing the state attorney's office to use everything we collected during our investigation. The prosecutor moves faster than I expected. 3 weeks after our meeting, 2 police officers arrest Lowe at his home early in the morning. The local news shows footage of him being led out in handcuffs, while his attorney Blake follows behind yelling at the reporters. The charges include 8 counts of fraud for falsifying medical records, 3 counts of practicing medicine while impaired, and 6 counts of filing false documents with state agencies. Blake issues a statement saying his client maintains his innocence and looks forward to clearing his name in court. That same afternoon, Blake contacts Jeremiah with a plea deal proposal. Lowe will permanently surrender his medical license, cooperate fully with the investigation into hospital administrators, and plead guilty to reduce charges if the state drops the impairment counts. The prosecutor calls me that evening to get my input on the plea deal. She says Lowe's cooperation could help build stronger cases against the hospital administrators who knew about his problems, but let him keep operating. I tell her I care more about preventing future victims than punishing Lowe specifically, so if his testimony helps expose the system that protected him, I support the deal. She says she'll recommend the plea agreement to her boss with the condition that Lowe receives actual prison time and not just probation. The hospital fires their chief of surgery the day after Lowe's arrest makes the news. Their public statement says the termination resulted from the internal investigation's findings about failure to properly supervise surgical staff and address documented safety concerns. 2 other administrators are also fired within the same week. One was the risk management director, who handled settlement negotiations and insisted on non-disclosure agreements for every case. The other was the medical director, who signed off on Lowe's surgical privileges despite multiple complaints from nursing staff about his behavior in the operating room. Jeremiah gets copies of their termination letters through discovery requests in ongoing cases against the hospital. The letters reference specific emails and meeting notes where these administrators discussed Lowe's high complication rate, but decided not to restrict his surgery schedule because he generated significant revenue for the hospital. One email from the chief of surgery to the medical director specifically mentions that Lowe's surgical volume brought in over $2 million annually, and losing that revenue would hurt the department's budget. The email was written 6 months before my surgery, proving they knew about problems long before Roy died. Regional Medical holds a press conference 4 months after my corrective surgery. The new chief of surgery stands at a podium with the hospital's CEO and board chairman. They announce sweeping changes to surgical safety protocols, including mandatory peer review for any surgeon with complication rates above department averages. The new policy requires immediate suspension of surgical privileges for any doctor showing signs of impairment during procedures. They're also banning the use of non-disclosure agreements in any future malpractice settlements, saying transparency serves patient safety better than protecting the hospital's reputation. The CEO specifically mentions that victims who came forward about their experiences prompted these reforms. Grace watches the press conference with me and points out they never actually apologize for what happened, just announce they're making changes going forward. I noticed the same thing, but figure the lawyers probably told them not to admit fault since there are still active lawsuits pending. Jeremiah sends me a text during the press conference saying 3 of his other clients just got significantly better settlement offers from the hospital after this public announcement. A patient safety organization invites Melissa and me to speak at their annual conference 6 months after everything started. The conference brings together doctors, nurses, hospital administrators, and patient advocates to discuss preventing medical errors. Melissa and I prepare a joint presentation about how non-disclosure agreements protect institutions at the expense of future patients. We explain how Roy's family couldn't warn anyone about Lowe's negligence because of their settlement agreement, which meant I had no way to know I was at risk. We talk about how the hospital prioritized protecting their reputation and avoiding lawsuits over fixing the actual problems that were hurting patients. I show the duplicate surgical reports and explain how easy it would have been for the records to stay mixed up forever if I hadn't pushed for answers. Melissa describes fighting for months to get her father's actual medical records, while the hospital kept giving her files from a different patient. We end our presentation by showing the timeline of how many patients were harmed between Roy's death and when the pattern finally got exposed. The audience of about 200 people gives us a standing ovation. 3 hospital administrators approach us afterwards saying they're going to review their own settlement practices after hearing our story. Blake negotiates the final terms of Lowe's plea deal 9 months after my corrective surgery. Lowe pleads guilty to 4 counts of fraud for falsifying medical records and 2 counts of filing false documents. He receives a sentence of 2 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. The judge also orders him to pay restitution totaling $300,000 to be divided among his victims based on the severity of harm each person suffered. Lowe stands in court, looking nothing like the confident surgeon who operated on me. He's lost weight, and his hair has gone gray. When the judge asks if he wants to make a statement, he apologizes in a shaky voice to everyone he hurt through his negligence and poor judgment. He says he let his pride and fear of consequences override his duty to his patients. Grace and I sit in the courtroom gallery watching him get sentenced. I don't feel satisfaction or anger, just relief that he can't hurt anyone else. Melissa sits 2 rows behind us with her mother. After the sentencing, we all go to lunch together and talk about how strange it feels to finally have this chapter closed. The medical board publishes their final investigative report 11 months after my corrective surgery. The report is 90 pages long and details every failure in the system that allowed Lowe's negligence to continue for 3 years. They document 23 cases where Lowe had complications during routine procedures, 15 of which resulted in additional surgeries to fix his mistakes. The report shows how the hospital's focus on surgical volume and revenue created pressure on doctors to maintain high case numbers, even when they were struggling. It reveals that 4 different nurses filed complaints about Lowe's behavior in the operating room, but those complaints never reached the medical board because the hospital handled them internally. The report includes specific recommendations for every hospital in the state, including mandatory reporting of surgical complications to an independent oversight body and restrictions on how hospitals can use non-disclosure agreements in malpractice cases. The board recommends new legislation requiring hospitals to report any surgeon with complication rates significantly above their specialty average. Grace reads through the entire report and marks sections she thinks are most important. She says the recommendations look good, but wonders if hospitals will actually implement them without being forced to by law. I book a cabin in the mountains for the weekend, 3 hours away from everything that reminds us of hospitals and lawyers and medical records. Grace packs our bags while I load the car, and for the first time in 8 months, I lift the heavy cooler without that sharp burning sensation in my left side. The drive feels different without pain medication making everything fuzzy around the edges. I can focus on the road and actually enjoy the scenery instead of counting minutes until my next pill. Grace keeps looking over at me with this small smile, and halfway through the drive, she reaches across to squeeze my hand. We hike 2 miles to a waterfall on Saturday morning, something I couldn't have done a month ago without needing to stop every few minutes. My body moves the way it's supposed to again, muscles working without that constant interference of pain signals. We sit on the rocks by the water, and Grace tells me she was terrified I might never recover fully, that the damage might be permanent. I admit I had the same fear every single day since the corrective surgery. Sunday morning, we sleep late and make breakfast together in the cabin's tiny kitchen, and I realize this is the first weekend in 8 months where I haven't been secretly managing pain levels or hiding how much I'm hurting. My first day back at the office feels strange after months of working from home during recovery. My coworkers notice immediately that something's different about me. Jennifer from accounting says I look 10 years younger, and JC asks if I've been working out because I seem more energetic. I haven't told most of them about the medical malpractice case or the corrective surgery, just said I had some health issues that are resolved now. During lunch, 3 people comment on how much more engaged I seem in conversations, how I'm not constantly shifting position in my chair or making excuses to leave meetings early. I didn't realize how obvious my pain management had been to everyone around me. My productivity doubles in the first week because I'm not spending half my mental energy dealing with constant burning sensations and planning when I can take my next dose of painkillers. The brain fog that made simple tasks feel overwhelming is completely gone. My boss pulls me aside Friday afternoon and says whatever I did to get healthy, it's made a massive difference in my work performance. I thank him without explaining the full story about surgical negligence and 8 months of secret suffering. The email from Valerie arrives on a Tuesday morning with the subject line, "Good news to share." She writes that the hospital promoted her to attending surgeon last month, and several people told her it was partly because of her willingness to testify about what she witnessed in the operating room. The chief of surgery specifically mentioned her commitment to patient safety during the promotion announcement. She thanks me for giving her the courage to speak up instead of staying quiet like so many residents do when they see problems. Her email says she's been thinking about my case constantly since she gave her testimony, wondering if she should have done more to stop the surgery when she saw how impaired Dr. Lowe was that day. I write back telling her that her documentation saved my case, and possibly my life, that her notes were the evidence that proved everything. She responds within an hour saying she's going to make sure every resident she trains understands they have a duty to speak up when they see dangerous situations, even when it means going against senior surgeons. She asks if she can use my case as an anonymous teaching example in the residency program, and I tell her absolutely yes. Hiroshi's letter arrives in a cream-colored envelope with his return address printed in the corner. The handwriting is shaky but careful, and he starts by saying he's writing this during his final week of practice before retirement. He explains that testifying about Dr. Lowe's impairment during my surgery was the most important thing he did in his last months as an anesthesiologist. The letter describes how he's watched dangerous situations unfold in operating rooms throughout his career, and too often he stayed silent because speaking up seemed too risky for his position. He writes that medical professionals protect each other instead of protecting patients, and it's a systemic problem that destroys lives. His testimony about my case was his way of finally doing what he should have been doing all along. The letter ends with him saying he's glad he could help expose the negligence before he left the profession, and he hopes other doctors will find the courage to speak up earlier in their careers instead of waiting until retirement like he did. I keep the letter in my desk drawer and reread it whenever I need a reminder that some people in the medical system are trying to do the right thing. The Victim Assistance Fund has processed applications from 6 patients in the 3 months since I set it up. 3 of those cases have already settled successfully, with the fund covering expert witness fees and medical record retrieval costs that the patients couldn't afford up front. A woman named Susan sends me a thank you card saying the fund made it possible for her to pursue a case against the surgeon who left a sponge inside her during a routine procedure. Without help covering the initial legal expenses, she would have given up because she couldn't risk losing money her family needed for bills. Her settlement covered her corrective surgery and ongoing medical treatment. Another patient named Thomas emails to say the fund helped him hire the expert witnesses who proved his surgeon operated on the wrong knee, and his case settled for enough money to pay for the revision surgery he needs. The fund administrator sends me quarterly reports showing how many patients have applied and how many cases have moved forward because of the financial support. Seeing these results makes me feel like something good came from everything I went through with Dr. Lowe. Our final couples counseling session happens on a Thursday evening 6 months after we started. The therapist reviews how far we've come from that first session, when Grace was furious about all the secrets I'd kept and I was defensive about my reasons for hiding everything. She points out that we've learned to communicate about difficult topics instead of avoiding them, and we've built new patterns for handling stress together instead of separately. The therapist says she's seen couples face this kind of crisis, and it either destroys their marriage or makes it stronger than it ever was before. She tells us we're clearly in the latter category. Grace squeezes my hand and says she feels like we're actually partners now, instead of two people living parallel lives. I admit that being forced to trust her with the truth about my pain and the investigation was terrifying at first, but now I can't imagine going through any of it alone. The therapist gives us some maintenance strategies for keeping our communication strong and tells us we can always come back if we need support in the future. Walking out of her office, Grace says she's proud of us for doing the hard work instead of letting everything fall apart. Melissa calls me on a Saturday afternoon sounding excited and slightly overwhelmed. Her family's settlement money allowed them to expand Roy's memorial fund into a full nonprofit organization with a board of directors and paid staff. They're focusing on surgical safety advocacy and pushing for transparency in medical error reporting across the state. She asks if I'll join their advisory board to help guide their advocacy work, and I agree immediately. The first board meeting happens 2 weeks later in a conference room they're renting downtown. Melissa's mother is there along with 2 other families who lost relatives to surgical errors. We spend 3 hours discussing legislative priorities and public awareness campaigns. The organization plans to publish an annual report on surgical complication rates at every hospital in the state, using public records requests to gather data that hospitals usually keep hidden. Melissa wants to create a patient advocacy hotline where people can report concerns about their surgeries and get connected with resources. I volunteer to help develop educational materials about recognizing signs of surgical negligence and understanding your rights as a patient. Leaving that meeting, I feel like Roy's death is leading to real systemic changes that will protect other patients. The state legislator contacts our advocacy group through the nonprofit's website. Her email explains that she's been following the news coverage of Dr. Lowe's case and wants to sponsor a bill banning NDAs in medical malpractice settlements statewide. She asks if our organization can help draft legislation that balances patient privacy rights with the need to identify dangerous patterns of negligence. Melissa sets up a meeting at the legislator's office for the following week. We bring examples of how NDAs prevented Roy's family and other victims from warning people about Dr. Lowe's pattern of errors. The legislator takes detailed notes and asks her staff attorney to start drafting bill language. Over the next 2 months, we exchange multiple versions of the proposed legislation, refining the language to close loopholes that hospitals might use. The bill requires hospitals to report settlement patterns to the medical board and prohibits NDAs that prevent patients from discussing their medical care. Hospitals can still protect proprietary business information, but they can't silence patients about what happened in the operating room. The legislator introduces the bill in committee and invites me to testify about my experience. The bill passes the state Senate by a vote of 32 to 8 6 months after my corrective surgery. The House of Representatives approves it 3 weeks later, with only minor amendments. Melissa and I attend the signing ceremony at the state capitol, where the governor adds the new law to the books with reporters and cameras recording everything. The governor mentions Roy's case specifically and talks about how transparency in medical error reporting will save lives by identifying dangerous surgeons before they hurt more patients. The law takes effect in 90 days, giving hospitals time to update their settlement procedures and notify the medical board about existing patterns. Melissa's mother cries during the ceremony, and afterward she tells me this is what Roy would have wanted his death to mean. The advocacy organization publishes a press release explaining how the new law will work and encouraging patients to report surgical complications without fear of being silenced. Several other states contact us, asking for copies of the legislation so they can introduce similar bills. The letter arrives in my mailbox on a Tuesday with a return address I don't recognize. Inside is a handwritten note from a woman named Sarah, who saw my news interview about the medical malpractice case. She writes that watching me speak publicly about what happened gave her the courage to pursue her own case against a surgeon who made errors during her gallbladder removal. She had been terrified to come forward because the surgeon was well respected and she thought no one would believe her. My willingness to tell my story made her realize she wasn't alone and that speaking up was worth the risk. Her case just settled for enough money to cover the ongoing medical treatment she needs for the complications from her botched surgery. She thanks me for being brave enough to go public when I could have just taken the settlement money and stayed quiet. The letter ends with her saying she's going to use part of her settlement to help other victims find attorneys and medical experts. I add her letter to the folder where I keep Hiroshi's letter and Valerie's emails, reminders that telling the truth about what happened created ripples that reached farther than I expected. Grace and I sit at the kitchen table one Saturday morning looking at our bank account balance with the settlement money finally deposited. She suggests we could finally do the home renovation we've talked about for years, maybe turn the cramped kitchen into something we actually enjoy cooking in, and fix the leaky bathroom that's been driving us crazy since we moved in. I agree immediately, because we need something positive to focus on after everything we've been through with the legal battles and medical procedures. We hire a contractor the following week and spend evenings picking out tile samples and cabinet colors, arguing good-naturedly about whether we should go with white subway tile or the gray hexagon pattern Grace loves. The construction noise and dust become our new normal for 3 months, but watching the house transform into the space we've always wanted gives us something to be excited about together instead of just stressed and angry about medical negligence. 2 years after my original surgery, I stand in our renovated kitchen making coffee and realize the burning pain in my left side is completely gone and hasn't come back. My latest checkup showed no kidney damage, and my doctor says I'm as healthy as someone who never had complications at all. Grace and I are stronger than we were before this nightmare started because we learned to communicate about hard things instead of me hiding problems until they explode. The advocacy organization Melissa and I built has helped change state laws about medical transparency, and we've assisted dozens of other patients who were being pressured into silence by hospitals offering settlements with gag orders. The system still has major problems and dangerous doctors still slip through sometimes, but we proved that regular people speaking up can create real change when they refuse to stay quiet about what happened to them.